My name is Olivia Martinez, and I'm 29 years old. 3 months ago, I stood at my wedding reception watching my mother announce to all the guests that she was embarrassed by my budget ceremony and that she had tried to teach me better. What she didn't know was that the venue she was insulting was a private estate I had purchased 6 months earlier for $4.2 million, and that every single cheap detail she was criticizing had cost more than her annual salary. The moment I revealed the truth, her face went from smug superiority to absolute horror in about 3 seconds. If you're watching this story unfold, drop a comment about where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button, because what happened next proved that sometimes the sweetest revenge is letting people expose their own shallow values while you hold all the cards they don't know exist. But to understand how I got to that moment, standing in my own ballroom watching my family humiliate themselves while trying to humiliate me, I need to take you back to the beginning and show you how I spent 29 years being treated like the family disappointment simply because I chose a different path than they expected. Growing up as the youngest of 3 daughters in the Martinez family meant learning early that appearances were everything. My mother, Patricia Martinez, had built her entire identity around social status, designer labels, and making sure everyone knew that her family was successful and sophisticated. My father, George, was a successful corporate executive who enabled mom's obsession with image by providing the income to support an expensive lifestyle. My older sisters, Vanessa and Gabriella, had embraced this value system completely. Vanessa, now 35, had married a plastic surgeon and spent her days attending charity lunches and posting Instagram photos of her designer wardrobe. Gabriella, 32, worked in pharmaceutical sales and was engaged to an investment banker. Both of them lived in expensive houses, drove luxury cars, and made sure everyone knew how successful they were. Then there was me, the disappointment, the black sheep, the daughter who had chosen passion over prestige. I had always loved technology and computers. While my sisters were shopping and networking at country club events, I was teaching myself to code and building websites for small businesses. When it came time for college, my parents had very specific expectations about what I should study. Business administration or communications, my mother had said firmly when I was 17, something respectable that will help you meet the right kind of people and marry well. I want to study computer science, I had replied. The look of disappointment on her face had been devastating. Olivia, that's not appropriate for someone from our family. That's technical work, trade work. You're meant for something more refined. Computer science is one of the most valuable degrees you can, get right now, I had argued. The tech industry is exploding. This is where the future is. The future, my mother had said with a dismissive wave, is in making the right connections and presenting yourself properly. Technical skills are for people who can't succeed through intelligence and social grace. The implication was clear. Coding was for people who weren't smart or sophisticated enough to succeed in the real professional world. My parents saw it as barely a step above manual labor. But I had been stubborn. I had applied to several universities with strong computer science programs, gotten into my top choice with a partial scholarship, and enrolled despite my parents' disapproval. Fine, my mother had said when I refused to change my major. But don't expect us to brag about having a daughter who's basically a technician, and don't come crying to us when you realize you should have listened to our advice. College had been the best 4 years of my life. I had thrived in my computer science program, discovered that I had a natural talent for software development, and graduated with honors. I had also met my future husband, Thomas Reed, in an algorithms class during our junior year. Thomas was brilliant, kind, and shared my passion for technology. He came from a working-class family, his dad was a mechanic, and his mom was a nurse, and he understood what it was like to be judged for not fitting into certain social expectations. "Your family sounds exhausting," he had said, after meeting them for the first time during our senior year. "Why do they care so much about what other people think?" "It's all they've ever cared about," I had replied. "Image, status, making sure everyone knows they're successful and sophisticated." After graduation, Thomas and I both got jobs at tech companies in Austin, Texas. We moved into a modest apartment, lived frugally, and focused on building our careers and our relationship. We were happy, even though we were living on entry-level salaries and eating a lot of ramen. My family was not impressed. "You're living in a one-bedroom apartment like a college student," my mother had said during one of her rare visits, looking around our small living room with barely concealed distaste. "You're 23 years old. You should be established by now." "We're saving money," I had explained. "We're paying off student loans and building our careers." "Gabriella was married to a successful man by your age," she had countered. "Vanessa had already bought her first house. You're living like you're poor when you could be making something of yourself." The judgment was constant and wearing. Every phone call included some comment about my modest lifestyle, my technical job, or my choice to date someone from a working-class background. My sisters joined in, posting photos of their expensive vacations and designer purchases on social media while making subtle digs about my different priorities. "Some of us value experiences over material things," Vanessa had commented on one of my photos showing Thomas and me at a free outdoor concert. The implication was clear. I couldn't afford the real experiences that mattered. But what my family didn't know was that Thomas and I weren't struggling. We were strategically building something much bigger than they could imagine. 2 years after graduation, Thomas and I had developed a software solution for a problem we had noticed in the healthcare industry. Medical practices were using outdated systems for patient scheduling, billing, and record keeping, and we had created an integrated platform that streamlined everything. We had started the company, Meditech Solutions, in our spare time while still working our day jobs. We had bootstrapped it with our savings, worked nights and weekends to develop the product, and slowly built a client base among small medical practices. 3 years after launching, we had 50 clients and were generating $200,000 in annual revenue. We quit our jobs to focus on the company full-time, which my family interpreted as a sign that we were struggling. "I heard you quit your job," my mother had said during a phone call, her voice dripping with concern that was really judgment. "Are you having financial difficulties? Do you need money?" "No, Mom. Thomas and I started a company. We're working on it full-time now." "A startup," she had said, making the word sound like a disease. "Olivia, 90% of startups fail. This is incredibly irresponsible. You had a stable job and you gave it up to pursue some risky dream." "It's not a dream. It's a real company with real clients and real revenue." "How much revenue?" she had asked skeptically. $200,000 last year." $200,000 split between two of you is $100,000 each, she had calculated quickly. "That's less than you were probably making at your job. You took a pay cut to work longer hours with no job security. This is exactly the kind of poor decision-making that comes from not having proper guidance." There was no point arguing. In her mind, anything that wasn't a traditional corporate job or a prestigious profession was automatically inferior and risky. But Thomas and I kept working. We refined our product, improved our marketing, and slowly grew our client base. 4 years after launching, we had 300 clients and revenue of $2.4 million. We hired our first employees. We moved into a real office. We were succeeding beyond what most people would consider possible. And my family still thought we were scraping by. They thought this because Thomas and I maintained our modest lifestyle. We still lived in a simple apartment. We still drove our reliable but unremarkable cars. We still dressed casually and avoided expensive restaurants and luxury purchases. "It's sad that they're still living like they're broke," I overheard my mother tell Vanessa during a family dinner I had attended solo because Thomas was traveling for work. "Olivia is almost 30 and still living in an apartment. It's embarrassing." "At least she seems happy," Vanessa had said, in a tone that suggested happiness was a consolation prize for people who couldn't achieve real success. What they didn't know was that Thomas and I were investing every penny we could into growing the company and building our financial security. We weren't broke, we were strategic, and we were about to hit the biggest milestone of our lives: 5 years after launching Meditech Solutions, we were approached by a major healthcare technology corporation interested in acquiring our company. After months of negotiations, we sold Meditech Solutions for $37 million. After taxes and splitting the proceeds with Thomas, my personal share was $12.3 million. At 28 years old, I was wealthier than everyone in my family combined, and none of them had any idea. Thomas and I had discussed what to do with our newfound wealth. We could have immediately upgraded our lifestyle, bought expensive houses and cars, and made sure everyone knew we were successful. But we had both grown tired of my family's obsession with appearances and judgment of our choices. "I have a better idea," I had told Thomas one evening as we celebrated the acquisition closing. "Let's keep living exactly as we are for a while. Let's see how your family and my family treat us when they still think we're just getting by." "Your family is going to keep judging you," he had pointed out. "Exactly. And when they've made their feelings perfectly clear, we'll let them know the truth. I want them to see that everything they valued, the image, the expensive things, the social status, was never what mattered. I want them to realize they've been looking down on us while we were building something more valuable than anything they've achieved." Thomas had loved the idea. So we had agreed to keep our financial situation private for a while, make some strategic investments and purchases quietly, and wait for the right moment to reveal the truth. That moment would come at our wedding, 6 months later. Thomas and I got engaged 3 months after selling the company. We were in love, financially secure, and ready to build our life together. The engagement itself was simple and perfect, a quiet proposal during a weekend trip to Colorado, with no elaborate plans or expensive ring at first. When we announced our engagement to my family, their first questions weren't about our happiness or our relationship. They were about the wedding. "You'll want to have it at the Riverside Country Club," my mother had said immediately. That's where Vanessa had her wedding, and it was absolutely beautiful, very prestigious. "Actually, we're thinking about something more intimate and personal," I had said. "Intimate?" My mother's face had fallen. "Olivia, a wedding is about bringing families together and making a statement about who you are as a couple. You can't have some tiny ceremony in a backyard." "We're not having it in a backyard. We're just planning something that reflects our values and priorities." "Your values," she had said carefully, "should include making your family proud and hosting an event that's appropriate for our social standing." Over the following weeks, my mother had launched a full campaign to take over our wedding planning. She sent me messages multiple times a day with venue suggestions, all of them expensive and traditional. She forwarded me contact information for wedding planners she approved of. She even started telling people in her social circle about Olivia's wedding and where it would be held, places we had never even considered. "Mom, Thomas, and I are planning our own wedding," I had told her firmly during one particularly aggressive planning session she had arranged without my consent. "You're clearly overwhelmed," she had replied. "Planning a proper wedding is complicated and you don't have experience with these kinds of events. Let me help you avoid making mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" "Well, for instance, I heard you were considering that barn venue outside the city." "Olivia, a barn. Can you imagine what people would think? It would look like you couldn't afford a real venue." "Some barns are beautiful event spaces that cost tens of thousands of dollars," I had pointed out. "But people don't know that. They just see barn and think cheap. You need to think about appearances." It was the same conversation I had been having with my family my entire life, just applied to a wedding instead of my education or career choices. Vanessa and Gabriella had joined the chorus of judgment, offering their unsolicited opinions on everything, from the venue to the dress to the guest list. "You should really consider a destination wedding," Gabriella had suggested. "Somewhere exotic. Show people you have sophisticated taste. We want our friends to be able to attend without spending thousands of dollars on travel," I had explained. "The right kind of people won't mind the expense," she had replied. "And honestly, it's a good way to filter your guest list to people who matter." Thomas's family, in contrast, had been supportive and excited without trying to control anything. His parents just wanted us to be happy and have the wedding we wanted. The difference between the two families was stark and made me even more determined to plan things our way. That's when Thomas and I had made a decision that would lead to the most satisfying moment of my life. We would plan a wedding that looked modest and simple to anyone who didn't know better, but that was actually far more expensive and exclusive than anything my family could imagine, and we would wait until after they had shown their true colors to reveal what they had actually been criticizing. I started by purchasing a property, not renting a venue, but buying one. There was a beautiful estate about 40 minutes outside the city, sitting on 37 acres with a historic mansion, formal gardens, and stunning views. It had been on the market for several months at $4.2 million, and Thomas and I bought it in cash. We told my family we had found a venue, but kept the details vague. When my mother pressed for information, I showed her a few photos that I had carefully selected to make it look like a nice but modest estate rental. "It's pretty," she had said, in a tone that communicated it was anything but. "But it looks quite far from the city. And is that building old? It looks like it might need renovation." "It's a historic property," I had explained. "We think it has character." "Character is what people say when they mean old and cheap," Vanessa had muttered just loud enough for me to hear. Next, I hired one of the most exclusive wedding planners in the state. Diane Foster had coordinated events for celebrities and billionaires, and her services started at $150,000. She understood exactly what Thomas and I wanted, a wedding that appeared understated and simple, but was actually the epitome of quiet luxury. "We can absolutely do elegant simplicity," Diane had said during our first meeting. "The best luxury is always subtle. People with real taste and money don't need to be flashy." She was perfect. And when my mother asked who was coordinating the wedding, I simply said a local planner, without providing Diane's name or credentials. Every element of the wedding followed this pattern. The flowers were designed by a florist who had done arrangements for the White House, but the style was naturally elegant rather than obviously expensive. The catering was provided by a Michelin-starred chef, but the menu was seasonal and locally sourced rather than pretentious. The music would be performed by a string quartet whose members had played with major symphonies, but we weren't having a flashy band or DJ. To someone with my family's values, where status was about obvious displays of wealth, our wedding would look disappointingly modest. To someone with actual sophistication and taste, every detail would scream quiet luxury and impeccable quality. The dress was my favorite example of this. I worked with a designer who created custom gowns for royalty and A-list celebrities. My dress cost $47,000 and was an absolute work of art, hand-beaded silk with intricate lace details that had taken 3 months to create. But the style was elegantly simple rather than elaborately showy. When I sent my family a photo, their reactions were exactly what I expected. "It's very plain," my mother had texted. "Are you sure that's the dress you want? I was hoping you would choose something more dramatic, something that makes a statement." "I love it," I had replied simply. "Well, it's your wedding," she had written back, which we all knew meant, "You're making a mistake, but I'll pretend to be supportive." Gabriella had been more direct. "That dress looks like something from a department store. I mean, if budget is an issue, I can help you find something nicer." "Budget isn't an issue," I had told her. "This is exactly what I wanted." She had sent back an emoji of a concerned face, as if my taste was something to be worried about. The invitations provided another opportunity for my family to showcase their values. I had commissioned custom letterpress invitations from an artist whose work was featured in museum collections. Each invitation cost $120 to produce and was a small work of art. But the design was minimalist and elegant rather than flashy and ornate. "These are very simple," my mother had said when she received her invitation. "I thought you might do something with more color or embellishment. These look almost plain." "They're letterpress," I had explained. "It's a traditional printing method." "I know what letterpress is," she had replied impatiently. "I'm just saying they could have more visual impact. When Vanessa got married, her invitations had gold foil and ribbon. People commented on them for months." "I'm sure they did," I had said. managing not to add that those invitations had probably cost about $15 each and looked exactly like what they were. Expensive, but trying too hard. As the wedding approached, my family's criticism intensified. They complained about the location being too far from the city. They questioned whether there would be adequate parking. They worried about the old building being climate controlled. They suggested I was making a huge mistake by not having the wedding at a proper venue. "I'm just concerned that you're going to regret this," my mother had said during one of her many calls. "A wedding is one of the most important days of your life. You should want it to be impressive and memorable." "I promise it will be memorable," I had assured her. Thomas's parents, meanwhile, were excited and supportive. They didn't care about appearances or status. They just wanted to celebrate our marriage and spend time with family and friends. "Your family is a lot," Thomas's mom, Carol, had said to me, kindly, after overhearing one of my mother's critical phone calls. "But I want you to know that Henry and I think your wedding is going to be absolutely beautiful. We're so happy for you both." The contrast between the families made me even more committed to my plan. Thomas's family appreciated us for who we were, while my family only cared about how things looked to others. They were about to learn an expensive lesson about the difference between real class and performative status. The week before the wedding, my family's judgment reached its peak. My mother had invited me to lunch under the pretense of a final planning check, but really to make one last attempt to change my mind about the wedding. "It's not too late to move this to a real venue," she had said over salads at her country club. "I could call Riverside and see if they have any cancellations. We could make this into something appropriate." "Mom, I love our venue. I love our plan. Everything is exactly how Thomas and I want it." "But what about what we want?" she had asked, and for a moment the mask had slipped. This wasn't about my happiness or my wedding. It was about her ability to brag to her friends about her daughter's impressive wedding. "This is Thomas's and my wedding," I had said firmly. "Not yours." Her face had hardened. "Fine, but don't blame me when people are disappointed. I've done my best to guide you, but you've made it clear you don't value my opinion or experience." Vanessa had called me that evening with her own version of this conversation. "Mom is really upset, you know. She's embarrassed about this wedding. People keep asking her about it, and she doesn't know what to tell them. She can tell them it's going to be beautiful and personal and everything Thomas and I wanted." "But is it going to be impressive?" Vanessa had asked. "Because honestly, Olivia, your wedding is a reflection on all of us. When you choose to have some low-key event at a random old building, it makes our whole family look like we couldn't help you plan something better." "Maybe the problem," I had said carefully, "is that you're all so concerned about how things look that you can't appreciate what they actually are." "What's that supposed to mean?" "You'll see at the wedding." I had hung up feeling a mixture of frustration and anticipation. In just 1 week, everything would be revealed, and my family would have to confront their own superficial values. The wedding day arrived on a perfect Saturday in October. The weather was ideal, clear skies, comfortable temperature, just enough breeze to feel refreshing. The estate looked absolutely stunning, with the gardens in full autumn bloom and the historic mansion glowing in the afternoon light. Diane and her team had transformed the property into something magical. The ceremony would take place in the formal garden, with chairs arranged in a semicircle around a floral arch. The reception would be in the mansion's ballroom, which had been restored to its original grandeur with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the grounds. Every detail was perfect. The flowers were breathtaking without being overwhelming. The table settings were elegant and sophisticated. The lighting created an atmosphere that was romantic and intimate while showcasing the beauty of the space. My family arrived early, as immediate family typically does, and their reactions were exactly what I had expected. "Well, it's quite rustic," my mother had said, looking around the grounds with barely concealed disappointment. "Very country. I suppose it has a certain charm if you like that sort of thing." "The building is older than I expected," Gabriella had added. Did you have it inspected for safety issues? Vanessa was taking photos, but not in an admiring way. She was clearly documenting what she saw as my poor choices, probably to share with her friends later with commentary about how sad it was that her little sister couldn't plan a proper wedding. Thomas's family, in contrast, was genuinely impressed and delighted. "Olivia, this place is absolutely gorgeous," Carol had said, hugging me tightly. "You have wonderful taste." Henry, Thomas's father, was examining the architecture of the mansion with appreciation. "This is incredible craftsmanship. They don't build them like this anymore." The guests began arriving, and I watched my family's expressions as they greeted people and showed them to their seats. I could see my mother's forced smile as she made excuses for the venue to her friends. "Yes, Olivia wanted something different," I overheard her say. "Very casual and low-key, not what I would have chosen, but young people today have their own ideas." The ceremony itself was beautiful. Thomas and I exchanged vows we had written ourselves, in a setting that felt both intimate and grand. The string quartet played beautifully, and when we were pronounced husband and wife, I felt genuinely, deeply happy in a way that had nothing to do with impressing anyone. But the real moment I had been waiting for would come at the reception. After the ceremony, guests moved into the mansion for cocktail hour while the garden was transformed for dinner. The ballroom was revealed in all its glory, and I watched as people entered and looked around in amazement at the stunning space. My family's reactions were more complicated. They could see that the venue was beautiful, but they were still operating under the assumption that we had rented it for the day and that everything was done on a tight budget. "It's actually quite lovely inside," my mother had admitted to one of her friends. "I was worried it would be too rustic, but they've decorated it nicely." "Very creative use of a budget venue," Vanessa had agreed, which made it clear she thought we had found a cheap space and tried to make the best of it. The dinner was extraordinary. The Michelin-starred chef had created a menu that was both elegant and approachable, with each course perfectly executed. But because the food was beautifully simple rather than elaborately fussy, my family didn't recognize it for the culinary experience it was. "The food is fine," Gabriella had said to Vanessa, "but it's very simple. I was expecting something more elaborate." Budget constraints," Vanessa had murmured back. "At least it's edible." I had overheard this conversation and had to fight back a smile. They had no idea that the meal they were dismissing as fine had cost $350 per person. After dinner, as we were preparing to cut the cake and begin the toasts, my mother decided to make an announcement. She stood up, champagne glass in hand, and called for everyone's attention. "If I could have everyone's attention," she had said loudly, and the room had quieted. "I want to say a few words about Olivia and her special day." Thomas had squeezed my hand under the table. We both knew what was coming. "As Olivia's mother," she had continued, "I have watched her grow into an independent young woman who always does things her own way. Sometimes that way is different from what I might have chosen, but I've learned to accept that she has her own path." The passive aggression was palpable. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. "When Olivia told me she wanted to have her wedding at this venue," my mother had gestured around the ballroom, "I have to admit I was concerned. It's quite far from the city, and it's not what I would call a traditional wedding venue. I tried to guide her towards something more appropriate, more impressive, but she insisted on doing things her way." I could feel anger rising in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. This was exactly what I had expected, and I was ready. "I want everyone here to know that I did my best to help Olivia plan a beautiful wedding," my mother had continued. "I offered to contribute financially to move this event to a more prestigious venue, but she declined. She wanted something simple and budget-friendly, and I suppose there's nothing wrong with that, even if it's not what I had dreamed of for my youngest daughter's wedding." The room was silent now, with most guests looking deeply uncomfortable with this inappropriate speech. "So," my mother had concluded, raising her glass, "here's to Olivia and Thomas, who have proven that you don't need money or status to have a perfectly adequate wedding." I'm sure they're very happy with their choices, even if they're not what I would have made. She had sat down looking satisfied, as if she had just delivered a touching and supportive mother of the bride speech, rather than a passive-aggressive critique of my wedding choices. That's when I stood up. "Thank you, Mom," I had said, my voice clear and carrying across the ballroom. "I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. Since you brought up the topic of money and status, I think now is the perfect time to share some information about this venue and our wedding." My mother's smile had faltered slightly. She clearly hadn't expected me to respond to her speech. "You mentioned that this venue is not traditional and implied it was a budget choice," I had continued. "I want everyone here to know the truth about where we're celebrating tonight." I had pulled out my phone and opened the photos. I had prepared for this moment: the property listing, the purchase documents, and the estate's information. This old building is actually a historic mansion built in 1887, sitting on 37 acres of gardens and grounds. It was featured in Architectural Digest last year as one of the finest examples of Gilded Age architecture in the state. I could see confusion starting to dawn on my mother's face. "And just to clarify, Mom, we didn't rent this venue for our wedding. We bought it 6 months ago for, $4.2 million in cash." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Every single person was staring at me, then at my mother, then back at me. My mother's face had gone pale. "What?" "Thomas and I purchased this estate," I had continued, pulling up more documentation on my phone. "In fact, if everyone would like to see the deed, it's right here with both our names on it." I passed my phone to the guests at the nearest table, letting them see the official property records showing Olivia Martinez Reed and Thomas Reed as the owners of the estate. "You bought this place?" Vanessa had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We did. And since Mom brought up the topic of budget choices, I should probably clarify a few other things about our simple, budget-friendly wedding." I had begun walking around the ballroom, gesturing to different elements as I spoke. "These flowers that you said were nice earlier, they're designed by Marcus Chen, who did the floral arrangements for the White House state dinner last year. His services for today cost $68,000. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My mother looked like she might faint. "The food you described as fine but simple? That's the work of Chef Andre Baptiste, who has 3 Michelin stars and whose restaurant has a 6-month waiting list. He and his team prepared every dish you've eaten tonight. That simple meal costs $350 per person." Gabriella's fork had clattered to her plate. "This dress that you said looked plain and like something from a department store? It's custom designed by Vera Whitmore, who dressed 3 princesses for their weddings and whose gowns start at $30,000. Mine cost $47,000. My mother had actually gasped out loud at that number. "The invitations you criticized for being too simple? Those were hand-created by Bernard Rousseau, whose letterpress work is in the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art. Each invitation cost $120 to produce." I could see my family members doing rapid mental math, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as they realized how much money they had been dismissing as budget choices. The string quartet you barely noticed, they're members of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the wedding planner who coordinated everything, Diane Foster, whose client list includes celebrities and heads of state, and whose fee started at $150,000. I had paused, looking directly at my mother. "So, when you stood up and announced to all our guests that this was a budget wedding and that you had tried to guide me towards something more appropriate, you were actually insulting a wedding that cost more than most people spend on their entire house. The total cost of today's event is approximately $975,000, not including the estate purchase." The silence continued for another moment, and then someone started laughing. It was Thomas's Uncle Martin, who had clearly enjoyed watching my pretentious family get their comeuppance. "That's the best thing I've heard all year," Martin had said, raising his glass to us. "To Olivia and Thomas, who have more class in their pinky fingers than some people have in their entire bodies." Several other guests had joined in the toast, and I could see people whispering to each other, clearly discussing what had just happened. My mother had looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. Her face had gone from pale to bright red, and she was staring at me with an expression that mixed shock, humiliation, and dawning horror at what she had just done. "But Olivia," Vanessa had said weakly, "you live in an apartment. You drive an old car. We thought you were struggling." "No," I had corrected gently. "You assumed I was struggling because I didn't waste money on expensive things to impress people. Thomas and I have been running a successful company for the past 6 years. We sold that company last year for $37 million. After taxes and splitting the proceeds, my personal share was $12.3 million. Gabriella had actually put her hand over her mouth in shock. "We chose to live modestly because we were investing in our business and building real wealth, not performing wealth for people who value appearances over substance," I had continued. "And we chose to maintain that modest lifestyle, even after the sale, because we wanted to see how people treated us when they thought we were just getting by." I had looked around at my family members, who were all avoiding eye contact now. "The answer is that some people treated us with love and respect regardless of what they thought our financial situation was. Thomas's family welcomed me from the beginning and has been nothing but supportive. My family, on the other hand, has spent years making me feel inadequate and embarrassed about my choices. You've criticized everything from my education to my career to my relationship to this wedding." My mother had finally found her voice. "Olivia, I didn't know. If I had known you had money, I wouldn't have said those things." "That's exactly the problem, Mom. You shouldn't need to know someone has money to treat them with respect and dignity. The fact that you only value people based on their apparent wealth and status is exactly why I didn't tell you about our success." I had walked back to the head table and sat down next to Thomas, who had been watching this entire exchange with a mixture of pride and satisfaction. "I want everyone here to understand something," I had said, addressing the entire room now. "Thomas and I didn't plan this wedding to show off our wealth. We planned it this way because we wanted to celebrate our marriage in a setting that was meaningful to us, with details that reflected our actual taste and values rather than what would impress other people. Every element of this wedding was chosen because we loved it, not because of what it cost or how it would look to others. The fact that each element happens to be extremely high quality and expensive is because when you choose things based on excellence rather than price tags, you often end up with the most expensive options anyway." I had gestured around the ballroom one more time. "This is what real wealth looks like. It's quiet. It's confident. It doesn't need to announce itself or prove anything to anyone. And the people who truly have good taste and sophistication recognize quality without needing to see price tags." Thomas had stood up then and put his arm around me. "My wife is the most brilliant, talented, and accomplished person I know. She built a multi-million-dollar company through intelligence, hard work, and innovation. She did it while her own family was telling her she was making mistakes and that she should be embarrassed about her choices. I'm incredibly proud of her, and I'm honored to be her husband." The guests had erupted in applause. Real applause from people who appreciated what I had accomplished and how I had handled my family's years of judgment. My family, meanwhile, looked like they wanted to disappear. My mother was staring at the table, her face still flushed with embarrassment. Vanessa and Gabriella were whispering furiously to each other, probably trying to process how drastically they had miscalculated my situation. My father, who had been quiet throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke up. "Olivia, I owe you an apology. We all do. We judged you unfairly, and we made assumptions based on superficial observations. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm sorry it took this moment for me to say it." It was the first genuine thing I had heard from any of my family members in years. My father had always been more reasonable than my mother, but he had gone along with her values and judgments to keep the peace. "Thank you, Dad," I had said sincerely. "I appreciate that." My mother still hadn't apologized. She was still processing the humiliation of having publicly criticized a nearly $1 million wedding and insulted her daughter's extremely successful life in front of 150 guests. "Mom," I had said, looking directly at her, "do you understand now why I didn't tell you about our success?" She had looked up at me, tears in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of genuine remorse or tears of embarrassment at being exposed. "You made me feel small my entire life," I had continued, my voice gentle but firm. "Every choice I made was wrong in your eyes. My education was wrong, my career was wrong, my relationship was wrong, this wedding was wrong. Nothing was ever good enough because it didn't match your narrow definition of success and status." "I only wanted the best for you," she had said weakly. "No, Mom. You wanted me to look successful according to your standards, so you could brag about me to your friends. There's a difference between wanting the best for someone and wanting them to make you look good." The truth of that statement had hung in the air. Several guests had nodded in agreement, and I could see understanding dawn on my mother's face. The reception had continued after that, though the energy had definitely shifted. Some guests came up to congratulate Thomas and me, expressing admiration for how we had built our success and handled my family's judgment. Others carefully avoided the topic, perhaps feeling uncomfortable about the family drama they had just witnessed. My mother had left early, claiming a headache. Vanessa and Gabriella had stayed, but had been subdued and quiet for the rest of the evening. My father had pulled me aside before he left to drive my mother home. "Your mother is going to need time to process this," he had said. "She's embarrassed and hurt, but I think underneath that, she's also realizing that she's been wrong about a lot of things." "I hope so," I had replied. "But Dad, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to chase after her approval anymore. I'm done trying to prove myself to people who have already decided I'm not good enough." "I understand," he had said. "And for what it's worth, I think you and Thomas have built something incredible. I'm proud of you, even if I haven't always shown it." The rest of the evening had been wonderful. Thomas and I danced, celebrated with friends, and enjoyed every moment of our wedding without the weight of my family's judgment hanging over us. At the end of the night, as we stood on the mansion's balcony looking out over the illuminated gardens, Thomas had wrapped his arms around me. "That was the most epic takedown I've ever witnessed," he had said with a laugh. "Your mother's face when you revealed the property cost was priceless." "I probably could have handled it more privately," I had admitted. But after years of her publicly criticizing my choices, I wanted everyone to see the truth. "She deserved it," Thomas had said firmly. "They all did. They spent years making you feel inadequate, and tonight they learned that you were more successful than any of them the entire time." He was right. And while the confrontation had been uncomfortable, it had also been necessary. My family needed to see that their values were shallow and that their judgment of me had been completely wrong. The days following the wedding were interesting. My phone had been flooded with messages from relatives and family friends. Some were apologetic, acknowledging that they had joined in criticizing my choices without really knowing my situation. Others were clearly just trying to get back in my good graces now that they knew I was wealthy. "I always knew you were special," my Aunt Elena had texted, despite having made several comments over the years about my lack of ambition. "We should get together for lunch," my cousin Maria had written, even though she had barely spoken to me in the past 5 years. I ignored most of these messages, recognizing them for what they were, attempts to access my wealth and status now that they could see it. But the most significant message came from my mother 4 days after the wedding. It was a long email that she had clearly spent considerable time writing. "Olivia," it began, "I have spent the past few days doing a lot of thinking and soul-searching. What happened at your wedding was humiliating, but I deserved that humiliation. You were right about everything you said. I have spent your entire life judging you based on superficial standards and trying to mold you into someone who would make me look good to my friends. I valued appearances over substance, and in doing so, I failed to see and appreciate the incredible person you actually are. You built a successful company through intelligence and hard work. You found a loving partner who supports and respects you. You created a life that is genuinely fulfilling and meaningful, and I couldn't see any of that because I was too focused on what kind of car you drove and where you lived. I am deeply sorry for the years of criticism and judgment. I am sorry for making you feel like you were never good enough. And I am especially sorry for what I said at your wedding. You deserved a mother who celebrated your achievements and supported your choices, and I failed to be that mother. I understand if you need time and space from me. I hope that eventually we can rebuild our relationship on a foundation of genuine respect rather than superficial expectations. I love you and I am proud of you, even though I failed to show it when it mattered. Love, Mom. I had read the email 3 times, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions. Part of me was angry that it had taken such a dramatic public humiliation for my mother to recognize her behavior. Part of me was sad about all the years we had lost to her superficial values. But part of me was also hopeful that maybe, finally, we could have a real relationship. I had responded simply, "Thank you for the apology. I need some time to process everything, but I appreciate you taking responsibility for your actions. We can talk in a few weeks." Vanessa and Gabriella had also reached out with varying degrees of genuine remorse. Vanessa's apology seemed more authentic. She acknowledged that she had been judgmental and superficial, and that she had been jealous of my independence and willingness to forge my own path. Gabriella's apology was more self-focused. She was clearly embarrassed about how she had looked at the wedding and wanted to smooth things over quickly. But at least she had recognized that she needed to apologize. Thomas and I had spent the week after the wedding at the estate, essentially having our honeymoon at our new property. We walked the grounds, made plans for renovations and improvements, and discussed what we wanted to do with the space. We could host retreats here, Thomas had suggested, technology conferences, startup workshops, use it as a space to help other entrepreneurs. "I love that idea," I had replied. "We could also open the gardens to the public certain times of year, share this beauty with people who might not otherwise get to experience places like this." We had always planned to use our wealth for meaningful purposes, not just accumulate expensive things. The estate could be both our home and a space that benefited others. 2 months after the wedding, I had lunch with my mother. It was the first time we had spoken face-to-face since the reception, and I could see that she had genuinely changed. She asked about my life, my business, my plans for the future, not in a judgmental way, but with genuine interest and curiosity. "I've been doing a lot of reading about the tech industry," she had said at one point. "I realize now that I never even tried to understand what you were building. I just dismissed it as technical work without recognizing that you were creating something innovative and valuable." "It's never too late to learn," I had replied. "If you're genuinely interested, I'd be happy to explain what we built and why it mattered." We had spent the rest of lunch talking about Meditech solutions, how Thomas and I had identified the problem we were solving, and how we had built the company from the ground up. My mother had listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and seeming genuinely impressed by what we had accomplished. "I wish I had taken the time to understand this years ago," she had said, as we were finishing our meal. "I missed out on so much by being focused on the wrong things." "But you're taking the time to understand it now," I had pointed out. "That's what matters." It wasn't a complete transformation. My mother still cared about appearances and status more than I thought was healthy, but she was making an effort to value substance over superficiality, and that was real progress. My relationship with Vanessa had also improved. She had admitted during one conversation that she had always been a little jealous of my independence and my willingness to pursue what I actually wanted rather than what was expected. "I chose my husband partly because he was a plastic surgeon," she had confessed. "Not just because I loved him, but because I knew Mom would approve and be able to brag about it. And honestly, I'm not even sure anymore if I made the right choice or if I just wanted to meet everyone's expectations." "It's not too late to figure out what you actually want," I had told her. "You're 35, not 95. You have time to build a life that's authentic to you." Gabriella had been slower to change. She was still very focused on image and status, and I suspected the main lesson she had learned from the wedding was to be more careful about judging people's financial situations. But at least she had stopped making snide comments about my choices. 6 months after the wedding, Thomas and I hosted our first event at the estate, a weekend retreat for young entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds. We brought in 30 participants who were building startups in technology, providing them with mentorship, resources, and a beautiful space to work and learn. This is incredible. One participant, a young woman named Jasmine who was building an education technology platform, had said as we showed her around the grounds, "I've never been anywhere like this. It feels like anything is possible here." That was exactly the feeling we wanted to create. The estate represented what was possible when you focused on building real value rather than performing success for others. My family came to the closing ceremony of that first retreat. My mother watched as Thomas and I talked with the participants about our journey, about the mistakes we had made and the lessons we had learned, about building something meaningful rather than just building something profitable. Afterwards, she had pulled me aside. "I finally understand what you were trying to tell me at your wedding," she had said. "This helping these young people, using your success to create opportunities for others, this is what real accomplishment looks like. Not expensive cars or luxury vacations or things you can brag about at the country club." "I'm glad you see that," I had replied, "because Thomas and I are planning to do a lot more of this. We want to use our resources to make a real difference." "I'd like to help," she had offered. "Not financially, I know you don't need that, but maybe I could volunteer, help with coordination or mentoring. I spent 30 years focused on superficial things. I'd like to spend the next 30 doing something meaningful." I had been surprised by the offer, but genuinely touched. "I think that would be wonderful, Mom." A year after the wedding, Thomas and I sat on the estate's back terrace, watching the sunset over the gardens and discussing our plans for the future. We had hosted 4 successful entrepreneur retreats, opened the gardens to the public twice a month for community events, and started a scholarship program for students studying computer science at state universities. "Do you ever regret how you handled the wedding?" Thomas had asked. "The public confrontation with your family?" I had thought about it carefully before answering. No, they needed to see that their values were wrong, and they needed to see it publicly, because they had been publicly judging me for years. If I had told them privately about our success, they would have just adjusted their behavior around me while continuing to judge other people the same way. "That's fair," Thomas had agreed. "And it did lead to some real changes. Your mom has become a completely different person." He was right. My mother had spent the past year volunteering with our programs, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and genuinely trying to be less focused on appearances and more focused on substance. She still cared what people thought. That was probably never going to change completely, but she was working on caring about the right things. Plus, I had added with a smile, it was pretty satisfying to watch her face when I revealed that the budget venue she had been insulting was a property we owned. Thomas had laughed. "That was one of the greatest moments of my life. Right up there with marrying you." "I should hope marrying me ranked slightly higher than watching my mother get her comeuppance," I had teased. "Slightly," he had agreed with a grin. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sky turn pink and gold as the sun set. "You know what the best part of all this is?" I had said eventually. "It's not the money or the estate or even the satisfaction of proving my family wrong. It's that we built a life that's actually meaningful to us. We didn't chase someone else's definition of success. We created our own. And we get to help other people do the same thing," Thomas had added. "Every person who comes through our programs and learns that they can build something on their own terms that's worth more than anything." He was absolutely right. The money was nice. The estate was beautiful. The vindication of proving my family wrong had been satisfying. But the real reward was the life we had built together and the opportunity to help others build meaningful lives too. 2 years after the wedding, I was featured in a business magazine article about successful female entrepreneurs. The interview focused on how Thomas and I had built Meditech solutions, but also on our current work with the entrepreneur programs at the estate. The article included a quote that I thought captured everything perfectly. Real success isn't about impressing other people or meeting their expectations. It's about building something meaningful, staying true to your values, and using your resources to make a positive impact. Everything else is just noise. My mother had framed that article and hung it in her living room, right next to the photos of Vanessa's and Gabriella's weddings. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. She was finally proud of me for the right reasons, not because of what I could help her brag about, but because of what I had actually accomplished. The relationship between my family and me would never be perfect. There were still moments when old patterns emerged, when my mother would make a comment that revealed she still cared too, much about appearances, or when my sisters would default to their old competitive dynamics. But the wedding had fundamentally changed our family dynamics. They could no longer dismiss or judge my choices because they had learned in the most dramatic way possible that their judgments had been completely wrong. More importantly, they had learned that there were different ways to measure success and value, and that their way wasn't necessarily the right way. Thomas and I continued to live relatively modestly despite our wealth. We invested in experiences and meaningful projects rather than expensive possessions. We drove nice but not flashy cars. We dressed well but not ostentatiously. And we found that the people who mattered, the people who had real depth and character, appreciated us for who we were, not what we had. The estate became known as a center for entrepreneurship and innovation, hosting hundreds of participants over the years. Many of them went on to build successful companies, and they often credited their time at our retreat as a turning point in their journey. You showed me that success doesn't have to look like what everyone else thinks it should look like, one former participant told me years later. You gave me permission to build something authentic instead of something impressive. That was the legacy I wanted to leave, not a legacy of wealth accumulation or status achievement, but a legacy of authenticity and meaningful impact. 5 years after the wedding, I stood in the same ballroom where I had revealed the truth to my family, watching a new group of entrepreneurs present their startup ideas to potential investors. My mother was in the audience, having become one of our program's most dedicated volunteers. She was taking notes and asking thoughtful questions, genuinely engaged in helping these young people succeed. Thomas came up beside me and took my hand. "Remember when your family thought this was a budget venue?" he said with a smile. "How could I forget?" I replied. "That was one of the best moments of my life." "Second best," he corrected. "Marrying me was still the best." "Obviously," I agreed, laughing. As we watched the presentations, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. All the years of being dismissed and criticized, the decision to hide our success and see how people treated us, the dramatic reveal at our wedding, the slow rebuilding of family relationships, and finally, the meaningful work we were doing now. If I could go back and do it differently, tell my family about our success earlier, avoid the public confrontation, take the easier path, I wouldn't. Everything had happened exactly as it needed to happen. My family had needed to see their values challenged. I had needed to stand up for myself publicly and definitively. And the dramatic nature of that moment had created real, lasting change that might not have happened otherwise. The lesson I had learned, and the lesson I tried to pass on to everyone who came through our programs, was simple. Define success on your own terms, stay true to your values, and don't waste energy trying to impress people who value the wrong things. The right people will recognize your worth regardless of how much money you have or how expensive your possessions are. And sometimes the most satisfying revenge against people who have judged and dismissed you is simply succeeding on your own terms and letting them realize they were wrong the entire time. If you're watching this and recognizing patterns from your own life, family members who judge your choices, relatives who care more about appearances than substance, people who make you feel like you're never good enough, I want you to know that their opinions don't define your worth. Build the life you want, not the life others expect you to have. Define success on your own terms. And don't waste time trying to prove yourself to people who have already decided you're not good enough. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and letting your success speak for itself. And if that success happens to come with a dramatic reveal at your wedding that leaves your judgmental family members speechless, well, that's just a bonus. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear that they don't have to meet other people's expectations to be successful and valued. Drop a comment about your own experiences with family judgment or defining success on your own terms. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself and building an authentic life. Remember, you don't owe anyone a performance of success that meets their standards. Your worth isn't determined by their approval.